Good morning. Welcome to our morning worship to Glen Church. I want to invite you to open your Bibles to the first chapter of Daniel and to leave them open there as we are looking at this chapter today and thinking about what it means to be a person of faith in an environment that is not of faith. Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up to all this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." That's Isaiah 39, verses 5 to 7. What Isaiah predicted to King Hezekiah is exactly what happened to Daniel and his three friends. They went from being royalty and nobility to being servants in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Daniel 1:2 says, as we noted last week, that Nebuchadnezzar, when he sacked Jerusalem, took some of the vessels from the temple in Jerusalem and took them back to Babylon and put them in the temple of his god. They were kind of trophies. They were an indication that, in his mind at least, his God was better than their God. His God was more powerful than their God. But he didn't just take objects. He took people too. He took lots of people with him, but not just any people. He took with him the cream of the crop. He took the very best that Jerusalem had to offer. In fact, we're told in chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, that he commanded the chief eunuch to bring some of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So that was his plan, was to bring these people, the very best of the people, that he could find in Jerusalem and bring them to Babylon. He was continuing what was a common practice among kings in the ancient world. If you conquered another nation or another people, or even another city, it was customary to dislocate some of the population and bring them as captives back to your city. Now, there were a couple of reasons for that. One was that you were able to have the services of some of the most accomplished people of other cultures and other civilizations, and so it enriched your own. But the other reason was that it weakened the population who remained so that there wouldn't be anybody left behind who would be likely to lead any kind of rebellion. You would take away everybody that you thought might have that kind of ability, and you would make sure there was nobody left behind who could cause you trouble. Listen to this statement in 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 14, about Nebuchadnezzar, that he carried away all Jerusalem and all the officials and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives and all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. He took away everybody who had ability. He took away everybody who had administrative ability. He took away all the warriors. He took away everybody he could take and just left behind the people who would work the land and who probably would never cause him any problems. That's why Daniel and his three friends ended up in captivity in Babylon. Now, when we first read Daniel chapter 1, I think it doesn't sound as if Daniel and his three friends were going to have it so bad. They were going to get the best education that Babylon had to offer. They were going to learn a new language. They were going to eat from the king's table. They were going to serve in the king's palace. They weren't exactly going to be field hands. It's not like they were going to be sent to labor in the mines until they dropped dead of exhaustion. They were going to have some pretty cushy assignments, it sounds like. But Daniel declined to go along with all that because he recognized something much more sinister that was going on. What Daniel realized was that Nebuchadnezzar's real goal was to assimilate him and his friends into Babylonian culture, and by so doing, to draw them away from their God. That's what Nebuchadnezzar wanted to do. He wanted to draw them away from their God. Now, how was he going to do that? Well, the chapter tells us. First of all, he was going to do it through indoctrination. Once he had them away from Jerusalem, he was going to enroll them in what my friend Dan Williams has described as the University of Babylon. He was going to send them to graduate school because notice verse 4 of chapter 1 says they were already well educated and competent. But that wasn't good enough. What he wanted them to do was be trained in the ways of Babylon. And that hadn't happened yet. In the latter part of verse 4, they were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. He had to fill in the gaps that would make Babylonians out of them. Verse 5 says they were to be educated for 3 years in the ways and the thinking of Babylon. And remember, those were pagan ways. They were not the ways of the people of God. They didn't come from the law of Moses. They weren't informed by spirituality or morality. They were informed by the pagan excesses to which Nebuchadnezzar himself was a part. And notice Nebuchadnezzar wanted young minds. He instructed the chief of the eunuchs to go get youths, young people with pliable minds, young people who were not yet set in their ways, young people who could more easily be indoctrinated. Let me ask you a question. If you wanted to change the culture of a nation, where would you start? Who would you start with? You wouldn't start with people who were already set in their ways. You'd start with people who were pliable. You would start with people who were going to be the up-and-coming generation of the future, the thinkers and the doers of the future. That's where you'd start, and that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar was doing. He wanted to change the culture of Israel, and in order to do that, he brought youths from Israel in order to have them indoctrinated in the ways of Babylon. Do you think that helps explain why our universities today have become hotbeds of radical thinking of all sorts? And they have. If you've had any experience at all around any of our universities, you know what I'm talking about. They are hotbeds of radical thinking. You know, traditionally, universities were supposed to be places where ideas of all sorts were discussed and examined and weighed and argued back and forth. That's what education was all about. But it's not like that anymore. Now, if you don't strictly toe the line with the social agenda and the immoral agenda and the intellectual agenda of the people who are in power, you're out. You will not be tolerated. You can't stay there. You can't be part of that. You cannot discuss other ideas. You've got to be indoctrinated. They are no longer institutions of higher learning. They are institutions of indoctrination. That's what they're for. That's what they're for. And parents, remember that. When you get ready to send your children and decide where they will attend college, there's nothing wrong with studying the ways of the world. There's not anything wrong with studying the ways of the world, as long as you're thoroughly grounded in the ways of God and you're maintaining fellowship with God's people. But allowing your children to be isolated from their spiritual home base and allowing them to be bombarded daily by people who are hostile to their faith is a recipe for disaster. We wonder why so many young people turn away from the faith when they leave home and go off for more education. The problem is not the education, it's the nature of it. It's the nature of it. And sometimes it's the fact that they're not ready for it. We need to be realistic about that. We need to be realistic about what the world is trying to do to our children. Daniel survived it. Daniel survived it. But don't too easily assume that your children will, because the pressures to conform are enormous. They are more than you can imagine if you've not experienced it. So Nebuchadnezzar was going to indoctrinate Daniel and his 3 friends into the ways of Babylon. The second way he was going to pull them away from God was through compromise. Verse 5 says the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. I would guess that was probably the best that Babylon had to offer, don't you? I don't think any of that came from Food Dog. I imagine all of that came from some high-end supermarket. It came from the best. And so he was served the best, and that's what they were going to get to eat, was the very best. Why? Because he wanted them to become assimilated into the rich ways of Babylon. We might wonder, why did he care what they ate? Because he wanted them to get used to the luxuries of Babylon. Now remember, they were royalty and nobility back home, so they didn't have it too tough there. But apparently what they'd had in Jerusalem was nothing compared to what they could have in Babylon. And so they would get accustomed to that good life of Babylon, and they would no longer desire the more meager existence that they had had in Jerusalem. That must have had a strong appeal. And we'll talk more in just a minute about why that was a problem. But he wanted to get them to compromise their ways. The third way he was going to assimilate them into Babylonian culture was through transformation of their identity. You notice they had Hebrew names, verses 6 and 7, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. All four of those names are made up of some compound of a word for God in Hebrew. Daniel and Mishael, the word El is the Hebrew word for God. And Azariah and Hananiah, a compound of the covenant name of God, Yahweh. So they had names that reminded them to whom they belonged. They belonged to God. And their very names reminded them of that. But the man in charge of them, when they got to Babylon, changed all that, didn't he? He gave them new names. Daniel, he named Belteshazzar. And then he named the others Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know what Belteshazzar means? Belteshazzar means something like, may Bel protect his life. And Bel was the chief god of the Babylonians. He was also known as Marduk. Bel or Marduk. So Belteshazzar, he was given a name honoring the god of Babylon instead of the God of Israel. Now, we don't know for sure about the other names, but they probably had similar associations with the cult of Bel or of Marduk. But Nebuchadnezzar wanted the very names of these people to remind them who they now were, not who they used to be. I saw a portion back last month of Alex Haley's Roots, in the television presentation of it. And if you ever saw that, you remember the major character is Kunta Kinte, who was taken captive in Africa and brought to the U.S. as a slave. And one of the first things that slave owners always did was change the names of their slaves. They didn't say, what's your name? They gave them a name, the name they wanted them to have. And this becomes a major issue in the story. And over again, Kunta Kinte is asked, what is your name? And he said, my name is Kunta Kinte. And they would beat him and tell him, your name is Toby. Say it, your name is Toby. And they would beat him almost to death. And he wouldn't say it. Why wouldn't he say, my name is Toby? Because he knew what was going on. He knew that they were trying to change his identity from being that of a Mandinka warrior to being merely a slave in somebody's field. And he wasn't buying it. That's exactly what was going on in the book of Daniel. That's what was happening with him and with Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. The Babylonian officials wanted to erase all memory of their monotheistic Israelite past and give them names now that would identify with their God, even in their personal names. It is, as Sinclair Ferguson has said, that the way that we think about God, about ourselves, about others, and about the world determines how we live. And so if you can mold the way somebody thinks, you can mold the way they live. You change their identity. And that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar was doing with these four men from Israel. So Nebuchadnezzar and those with him were carefully trying to erase from memory all ideas that these men belonged to God and to make certain that they understood that they no longer belonged to God, but now they belonged to him. And they were no longer God's people. They were now his people. They no longer had a destiny determined by God. They had a destiny that would be determined by Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, he wanted them to be fully culturally assimilated away from their Hebrew history and into their Babylonian existence. Don't you just imagine that with most people who underwent that, and there were many others that we don't read about. Why do we read about Daniel? Because he didn't go along with it. Daniel didn't allow himself to be changed. And we need to ask why not, because we are constantly pressured with cultural assimilation too, aren't we? So as we're constantly pressured, we need to be asking ourselves, what did Daniel do? What did he think? What did he say? How did he act that kept him from being assimilated into Babylonian culture? Well, the answer is found in verse 8. I want you to look carefully at it. The ESV says, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank." He resolved that he would not do that. But the King James and the New King James translation is closer to the original when it says Daniel purposed in his heart. He purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's food or the wine that he drank. What that means is that before he was placed in the tempting situation, he decided he wasn't going to do it. He decided beforehand that he was not going to give in. He made a concrete decision before it ever happened that it was going to be a non-negotiable with him, that he would not defile himself. Now, why is that important? It's important because it means he wouldn't succumb to the pressures of the moment when they arose. How many times does our faithlessness come about because we're not ready? We're not ready for the pressure. We're not ready for the moment of testing. We're not ready for what we sang about a few minutes ago, in the hour of trial. We don't think about that ahead of time. We won't be ready when the time comes. And so Daniel knew that he had to be ready ahead of time. And that's how he managed to stay faithful. And that's how we do it too, by deciding beforehand that we're going to do the right thing and not the wrong thing. And we're going to do the right thing every time, and we're going to do the right thing all the time. We purpose in our hearts the same way that Daniel did. This is the most crucial part of Daniel's ability to escape defilement, his decision beforehand that he would not give in. Before Daniel ever took a public stand for his Israelite faith, he made a private decision of what he would and would not do. And if you and I don't make that private decision of what we will and will not do, we will not make the public stand. It's just that simple. That's how Daniel escaped the defilement that was being offered to him. But that raises a question, doesn't it? Have you ever wondered what was the problem with eating that food? I suspect that was good food. What was the problem with eating that food and drinking that wine? It seems like a small enough matter. Why did Daniel draw a line there? Some have suggested it was because the food had been offered to pagan gods. It had been offered to idols, and it probably had. But wouldn't that be true of the vegetables also? Remember what Daniel proposed to the chief of the stewards was, just give us 10 days of vegetables and water and see if we're not in better shape than everybody else, okay? But so the vegetables would have been offered in sacrifice as well. So some have suggested it wasn't that, but it was the fact that a pagan prayer had been said over that food. But you run into the same problem. The same prayer that would have been said over the roast beef was said over the green beans also, right? And so that really doesn't answer it. Others had said, well, it would have been violating Jewish dietary laws. And I'm sure it would. I'm sure there would have been some foods in there that would have been deemed unclean under the law of Moses. And that would have been problematic. But that doesn't explain why Daniel and his friends wouldn't drink the wine, because there's nothing in the law of Moses prohibiting the drinking of wine. So what was the problem with the food? I like Trimper Longman's suggestion that Daniel didn't want to eat the king's food or drink his wine because he wanted to make it clear that his and his friends' physical success was not due to anything done by Nebuchadnezzar, but it was due solely to an act of God. He didn't want anybody to say, oh, you're doing well, you're looking great because you've been eating the king's food. He wanted it to be clear that it had to be because he was doing what God wanted him to do, and God was blessing him. Longman even suggests, rightly I think, that the improvement in their physical appearance was nothing short of a miracle. Now, you've probably wondered about this. I have, and I've read Daniel 1 before. He says, let us eat vegetables and water. And then the text says at the end of the 10 days, they were what? They were fatter. Now, think about that. Think about that. If you want to fatten somebody up, I mean, when they send these young men to the NFL training camps, they do not give them more broccoli and more water. You know, they don't do that. Because you're not going to fatten up on that. You know, and you can say, well, you know, we need to fatten him up. Add some carrots. That'll do it. Give him more lettuce. You see what's going on here? Daniel proposes a test that absolutely cannot have anything to do with the food itself. He proposes a test that proves that this is an act of God. And at the end of 10 days, they are in better shape. They are even fatter in appearance. They're fatter in flesh, the Bible says. Why? Because God had made them that way. There was no doubt God was honoring Daniel's confidence in him by his determination not to defile himself by relying on the rich diet of a pagan king, but because he relied on God instead. And God blessed him for that. He blessed him for that. And he didn't just bless him with better physical condition. Because look at verse 17. It says, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And when Nebuchadnezzar examined them, he found that they were 10 times better than everybody else. They were light years ahead of the other people who were in the same role. In other words, God blessed them because they were faithful. Now, the lessons from this survival story are pretty obvious, aren't they? What we ought to learn from this. If we, as followers of Christ, are to practice faithful non-assimilation, we've got to be proud to wear the name of Christ. Do you notice throughout the book, Daniel keeps being called what? Daniel. Even though he's been given the name Belteshazzar by the Babylonians, the text continues to call him Daniel. What does it call his 3 friends? For some reason, the Babylonian name, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Or as our daughter used to say when she was little, and under the bed we go. But he's called by his Hebrew name. If you and I are going to be faithful to God and practice faithful non-assimilation, we need to be proud to wear the name of Christ, to be aliens and exiles in this world because of him. And another lesson is we have to be careful what we allow to shape our minds, because there are forces out there that are doing all they can to shape them in an anti-God fashion. It is up to us to do what the New Testament tells us to do, to set our minds on the things of God. Set our minds on the things of God. That's our decision. And then the third lesson, we have to purpose in our hearts that we will do what we know is right, just like Daniel did, even before we are pressured to do wrong. Purpose in your heart that you're going to do the right thing, then you'll be ready when the time of testing comes. And lesson number 4, if you want God's blessings for your life, you have to trust him. You have to trust him by walking in the ways he has set before you and not in the ways of the unbelieving world. You've got to trust him. You've got to walk in his ways. What does he call you to do? He calls you to follow his son, Jesus Christ, to walk in his ways. If you do that, it will make you a stranger in this world. It will make you an alien and an exile, 1 Peter says. That's okay. Because at the end of the day, when you stand in eternity, you will have everlasting life with God. And there's nothing better than that. We've got to learn to see beyond the present moment and live for what will be. And that's what God says will be if we follow in the ways of his Son. If you're ready to follow his Son today, we'll help you do it. Let's stand together and sing.